Garrett Vance adjusted the heavy torque wrench, his movements deliberate and entirely silent in the cavernous, drafty space of Hangar 4. The storm outside was slamming against the corrugated metal roof of the Oak Haven airfield, a relentless, icy November deluge that threatened to wash out the secondary runway. It was past 8 in the evening, 2 hours after he should have locked up the commercial repair bay, but the hydraulic line on a local charter aircraft required a complete overhaul before dawn. More importantly, finishing the job tonight meant a clear $300, the exact amount required for his daughter Chloe's Advanced Science Academy enrollment fee, a deadline that expired at midnight. Chloe was 7 years old, currently curled up in an oversized flight jacket on the old vinyl couch inside the corner office. She was meticulously sketching the turbine geometry of an advanced propulsion engine, her clear gray eyes tracking her father through the grease-stained glass window with a quiet, uncanny intelligence. She didn't complain about the cold or the lateness of the hour. She never did. She lived in the world Garrett built for her, a world constructed of mechanical blueprints, the smell of aviation fuel, and an unspoken, unbreakable bond between a father and his child. Garrett wiped his hands on a dark shop rag, the permanent, faint lines of grease embedded in the creases of his knuckles, resisting the coarse fabric. His phone buzzed against the metal workbench. It was a text from Julian, his former military logistics officer turned high-end security consultant. "Vivian is already en route to the Apex Lounge," the message read. "Don't you dare back out, Garrett. She's intimidating, she's brilliant, and she's exactly the wake-up call your life needs. Just put on a clean shirt." Garrett let out a slow breath through his nose. He had no desire to spend his evening at an ultra-luxury venue downtown, especially not on a blind date with Vivian Sterling, the notoriously cold, ruthless CEO of Sterling Aerospace. Her reputation preceded her in every business journal across the country, an uncompromising billionaire executive who managed global logistics, empires, and tech acquisitions with iron-fisted efficiency. Garrett was a 36-year-old single father whose life revolved around keeping his daughter safe and running a modest, independent aircraft repair shop. He knew exactly how elites looked at men who worked with their hands. After ensuring Chloe was safely settled next door under the watchful eye of their elderly neighbor Martha Higgins, Garrett changed into a crisp but slightly faded Oxford shirt, the best one he owned, and climbed into his 12-year-old utility pickup truck. The highway toward the city was black, slick, and dangerous. 10 miles outside the airfield, Garrett spotted a sleek, silver luxury transport sedan pulled far onto the shoulder, its hazard lights cutting weakly through the blinding sheets of rain. A woman stood just outside the open door under a completely inadequate designer umbrella, her posture rigid with an icy, controlled fury. It was Vivian Sterling. Even soaked by the storm, her presence was commanding. She was dressed in a tailored charcoal wool coat, her phone pressed tightly to her ear as she delivered rapid-fire, sharp instructions to an unfortunate assistant on the other end, trying to manage a breaking corporate crisis while stranded in the dark. Garrett pulled his truck over, stepping out into the pouring rain. He kept his distance, his hands open in a non-threatening manner. "Need a hand?" he called out over the roar of the wind. Vivian lowered her phone, her piercing green eyes running a swift, clinical risk assessment of Garrett's faded shirt and battered vehicle. "It's a proprietary electrical architecture," she said, her voice dropping into a chilly, definitive tone that she likely used to terminate multi-million-dollar contracts. "The digital bus system completely overrode the ignition. A standard roadside mechanic can't touch it. I've already summoned a specialized transport tow. Your transport tow is going to take 90 minutes to get out here in this flash flood," Garrett said calmly, his voice steady and completely unbothered by her frosty demeanor. "And your secondary battery isolation switch is what tripped. It shuts down the digital bus to protect the main core when water breaches the front cowl sensor." Vivienne went entirely still, her eyes narrowing. How could you possibly know that? Garrett walked to the front of her vehicle, popped the advanced carbon fiber hood, and pulled a small copper grounding strip from his pocket. Working entirely by touch in the freezing downpour, he bypassed the faulty sensor module with practiced, terrifyingly precise efficiency. Within 10 seconds, the luxury sedan's powerful engine roared to life, its digital dashboard illuminating the dark highway. Vivian stared at the engine, then at Garrett, a rare crack appearing in her carefully constructed armor. "Who are you?" Garrett wiped the rain from his forehead, looking at her directly. "I'm Garrett Vance. I believe we have a 7:30 reservation at the Apex Lounge under the name Julian sent you." The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic clicking of her windshield wipers. 30 minutes later, Garrett walked into the marble foyer of the Apex Lounge. He was acutely aware of his damp clothes and the faint, indelible shadows of grease beneath his fingernails. The matron looked at Garrett with immediate, thinly veiled condescension. But before a word could be spoken, Vivienne stepped up beside him, her presence immediately silencing the staff. They were seated at a secluded table in the back. The tension was palpable. Vivienne watched him over the rim of her glass, her gaze analytical, trying to reconcile the man who had effortlessly mastered her vehicle's elite engineering with the humble, quietly spoken father sitting across from her. Before their entrees could arrive, a loud, arrogant voice shattered the quiet ambiance of the dining room. "Vivienne, I heard you were in town, but I didn't realize you were auditing the local labor force." Bradley Thorne, a ruthless venture capitalist and Vivienne's most persistent, aggressive business suitor, stepped up to their table. He wore an immaculate, custom-tailored tuxedo, and his eyes locked onto Garrett with profound public disgust. "Did you hire a grease monkey to valet your car tonight, Vivienne, or are the local mechanics actually allowed to sit at the tables now?" Bradley's voice carried across the silent restaurant, causing several high society patrons to turn and stare. Vivienne's jaw tightened, her fingers gripping her wine glass until her knuckles turned white, her composure fracturing under the sudden public embarrassment. But Garrett didn't move. He sat perfectly still, his eyes locked onto Bradley with a cold, unyielding authority that had once commanded elite fighter squadrons over hostile territory. From the far side of the dining room, a decorated three-star general who had just entered the restaurant suddenly stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes widening in absolute shock as he looked at Garrett's face. General Arthur Pendleton stood frozen near the mahogany pillars of the dining room, his chest decorated with commendations, his gaze locked onto the back corner of the restaurant. Bradley Thorne didn't notice. He was too busy smiling down at Garrett with the practiced cruelty of a man who measured human worth entirely by a bank ledger. "Seriously, Vivienne," Bradley continued, his voice cutting through the soft jazz playing over the speakers, "if you need a reliable driver, I can recommend an agency. You don't have to charity case your way through the local auto shops." Vivienne's hands trembled slightly, a rare sliver of panic piercing through her usual corporate armor. She hated public scenes, hated the vulnerability of being exposed to social ridicule. She opened her mouth to sharply dismiss Bradley, but before she could speak, she caught Garrett's eyes. He wasn't angry, he wasn't embarrassed. Garrett simply sat there, his posture perfectly straight, absorbing Bradley's insults with a terrifying, unbothered calm. It was the look of a man who had stood in rooms far more dangerous than this one, facing men far more formidable than a venture capitalist in a tailored tuxedo. Garrett looked past Bradley, his eyes meeting General Pendleton's across the room. For a fraction of a second, a silent command passed between them, a subtle, imperceptible tightening of Garrett's jaw. The three-star general blinked, gripped the lapel of his uniform, and slowly took a step back, intentionally diverting his trajectory toward a table on the opposite side of the lounge. Vivienne caught the exchange. Her breath hitched. She looked from the retreating general back to Garrett, a profound wave of suspicion taking root in her mind. Garrett stood up smoothly. He didn't tower over Bradley, but the sudden shift in his physical presence made the wealthy investor instinctively take a half step back. Garrett reached into his pocket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and placed it flat on the white tablecloth. "The digital bus system on Vivienne's car is perfectly clear now, Mr. Thorne," Garrett said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded the immediate radius of the room. "And if I were you, I'd be much more concerned with the closing margins of your logistics acquisition in Savannah tonight than the state of my hands. You're bleeding capital." Bradley's face drained of color, his mouth opening, but finding no words. He hadn't announced that acquisition to anyone yet. Garrett turned his gaze to Vivienne, his expression softening into something genuine and warm. "Thank you for the half of a dinner, Vivienne, but my daughter has a cough and I don't like leaving her with the neighbor for too long. Good night." He walked away, his stride even and unhurried. Vivienne sat in silence, completely ignoring Bradley's panicked questions as he scrambled to check his phone. Her mind was racing. A local mechanic didn't know about confidential corporate acquisitions. A local mechanic didn't cause a highly decorated military legend to halt in his tracks. Who exactly had she just shared a table with? The next afternoon, the rain had ceased, leaving Oak Haven Airfield shrouded in a heavy gray mist. Vivienne stood outside the sleek glass doors of Sterling Aerospace's corporate headquarters downtown, but her mind was entirely elsewhere. Unable to shake the phantom weight of the previous night, she bypassed her afternoon executive meeting, climbed into her silver sedan, and drove toward the edge of the city. When she pulled up to Hangar 4, the sign out front read Vance Aero in clean, freshly painted letters. She stepped inside the open bay door, the sharp scent of hydraulic fluid and ozone hitting her senses. In the center of the concrete floor, a small girl was crying softly. Chloe was sitting on a plastic crate. A beautifully constructed, intricate model of a dual compressor turbine shattered at her feet. She had clearly dropped it, and the delicate carbon fiber blades were scattered across the floor. Vivian froze. In her world, when a subordinate failed or an asset broke, the reaction was immediate, cold, and punitive. She expected shouting. She expected a harsh lesson in accountability. Instead, Garrett dropped to his knees in the grease and dirt right in front of the little girl. He didn't look at the broken model. He looked only at his daughter. He gathered her small, trembling hands into his own large, calloused palms. "Look at me, Bug," Garrett said softly, his voice an anchor of absolute stability. "Is anyone hurt? Is anyone hurt?" "No," Chloe sobbed, wiping her nose on the sleeve of the oversized flight jacket. "But I worked on the turbine staging for 3 weeks. The Academy evaluation is tomorrow, Dad." "It's ruined. It's just material, Chloe. Everything made by hands can be rebuilt by hands," Garrett murmured, pulling her gently into his chest. He held her with a fierce, protective warmth that seemed to push the chill right out of the massive hangar. "We have 12 hours before the evaluation. That means we have exactly 11 hours to make it better than it was the first time. You and me. Deal?" Chloe buried her face in his shoulder, her tremors slowing down instantly, her breathing regulating simply by being held against him. Vivian watched from the shadows of the doorway, her hand gripping the strap of her luxury handbag. A strange, unfamiliar ache tightened in her chest. She had a net worth that could buy the entire airfield, an army of employees who feared her, and a mother who had taught her that weakness was a liability. Yet, looking at this humble man comforting his child, Vivian realized she had never felt a single moment of the absolute safety that Garrett Vance provided without even trying. She took a step forward, the heel of her shoe clicking against the concrete. Garrett looked up, his calm gray eyes locking onto hers, entirely unsurprised by her arrival. Before Vivian could speak, the high-pitched whine of an emergency siren began to echo from the main runway outside, followed by the frantic, crackling voice of the airfield tower controller over Garrett's desktop radio. "All units, we have an emergency landing scenario. Trans-Eastern Flight 840 has lost secondary hydraulic pressure on approach. Landing gear is failing to deploy." Garrett stood up instantly, his entire demeanor shifting from a gentle father to a razor-sharp tactical operator in the span of a single heartbeat. The crimson emergency strobe lights on top of Hangar 4 began to rotate, casting long, bleeding shadows across the wet tarmac. The mechanical wail of the airfield siren ripped through the heavy mist, shattering the quiet afternoon. Winston Briggs, the frantic airfield manager, was already sprinting down the maintenance lane toward the emergency response vehicles. His jacket was unzipped, flapping wildly in the wind as he yelled into a handheld radio. On the tarmac, a crowd of support mechanics and corporate personnel from the regional terminal were gathering, their faces pale as they looked up into the gray, unforgiving sky. Garrett didn't run. He walked with a swift, measured stride that carried an immense sense of purpose. Vivian followed him out of the bay, her expensive leather boots clicking against the wet asphalt, her eyes locked onto the back of his jacket. Chloe walked right beside her father, her small hand holding a rugged digital diagnostic pad, her expression completely devoid of the panic that was consuming every other adult in the vicinity. Near the primary fire truck, a man in a sharp navy blazer with gold corporate emblems was screaming at the airfield manager. This was Dominic Fletcher, the regional operations director for Trans-Eastern Airlines. He was sweating profusely despite the freezing air, his hands shaking as he pointed toward the horizon. "The landing gear is completely unresponsive," Dominic shouted, his voice cracking under the immense pressure. "The primary indicator is dead, and the backup manual release isn't catching. There are 42 passengers on that regional shuttle, including 3 members of my executive board. If they have to slide this plane in on its belly, the friction will spark the center fuel tanks." Winston Briggs wiped rain from his eyes, looking helpless. "The city emergency crews are still 10 minutes away, Dominic. Our local foam trucks are already deployed, but we don't have the heavy diagnostic override codes for this specific aircraft model." Garrett stepped into the center of the frantic circle. His presence alone seemed to draw the air out of their panic. He didn't raise his voice, but the low, steady resonance of his baritone immediately cut through Dominic's shouting. The secondary line didn't just lose pressure, Winston, Garrett said, looking up toward the low cloud cover where the faint roar of a twin-engine turboprop could be heard circling helplessly. Listen to the pitch of the left engine during the descent loop. The hydraulic return valve is jammed wide open. The fluid is foaming inside the reservoir. If your pilot attempts another manual blowdown while that fluid is aerated, the nose gear will collapse entirely upon impact. Dominic Fletcher stopped shouting, spinning around to look at Garrett with absolute disdain. He took in the faded work jacket, the grease on Garrett's hands, and the little girl standing quietly by his side. Who let a local grease monkey onto a live emergency tarmac? Dominic sneered. His corporate arrogance flares up despite the life-or-death crisis. This is an advanced commercial transport, you idiot. It's an enclosed digital hydraulic ecosystem. You can't diagnose a commercial failure by listening to the engine pitch from the ground. Step back before I have security throw you off the airfield. Before Garrett could even blink, Vivian Sterling stepped forward. Her towering, intimidating corporate stature completely filled the space between Dominic and Garrett. Her green eyes flashed with a lethal, icy glare that had brought global competitors to their knees. "Shut your mouth, Dominic," Vivian commanded, her voice dropping into a register that was terrifyingly calm. "If Garrett Vance says the fluid is foaming, you listen to him. You are currently losing control of your airfield, and your executive board is circling a graveyard. Let him speak." Dominic choked on his next breath, recognizing the billionaire CEO of Sterling Aerospace instantly. His arrogance evaporated into pure shock. "Miss Sterling, I didn't realize, but the manual says—" "The manual was written for ideal conditions, not a flash flood," Garrett interrupted smoothly. Chloe stepped up to her father's side, completely unbothered by the shouting adults. She reached up and handed Garrett a heavy-duty tactical headset from the side pocket of her flight jacket. She looked up at him with total, unwavering trust. "You can fix it, right, Dad?" Just like the simulator. Garrett looked down at his daughter, a warm, reassuring smile breaking through his serious expression. He patted her shoulder gently. "Always, Bug. Hold the diagnostic pad for me." Garrett slipped the tactical headset over his ears and stepped directly up to the main communications console built into the side of the lead airfield fire truck. He overrode the primary frequency with 3 swift keystrokes, tuning directly into the emergency aviation band. He pressed the broadcast button. His entire posture tightened, his shoulders squaring into a military stance that Vivian had never seen on a civilian. When he spoke into the microphone, his voice was no longer just calm. It carried the absolute, unyielding authority of a commander who had ruled the skies. "Flight 840. This is Oak Haven ground support. Disengage your primary hydraulic pump immediately. I repeat, cut power to the primary pump. You are feeding the foam in the reservoir." Over the static, heavy speaker of the fire truck, the frantic voice of Captain Lawrence Reyes crackled back. "Ground, we are dealing with a total systemic failure here. We don't have time for local advice. Who is this? Cutting the primary pump will drop our auxiliary pressure to 0. That bypass sequence is a classified military override protocol for heavy tactical transports. A civilian regional jet can't handle the pressure spike." Garrett didn't hesitate for a single second. He leaned closer to the microphone, his voice dropping into an icy, unmistakable rhythm that carried the weight of a legendary past. "This is Spectre 1, Lawrence. Secure the primary pump and cross-bleed the auxiliary pressure from your right engine braking loop. You have exactly 2 minutes before your approach threshold. Do it now." The radio speaker went completely silent. The heavy static seemed to freeze in the air. On the tarmac, Dominic Fletcher, Winston Briggs, and Vivian Sterling all stared at the console. Then, a sharp, gasping breath echoed through the speaker from the sky above. "Spectre 1, the pilot's voice whispered back, his frantic terror instantly replaced by an overwhelming, trembling shock. "Sir? You're alive?" The static coming from the fire truck's radio console was deafening, but Captain Reyes's whispered words cut through it with absolute clarity. On the wet tarmac, the silence among the ground crew was total. Winston Briggs lowered his clipboard, his mouth slightly open, while the rest of the support staff stared at the weathered, grease-stained back of Garrett Vance's jacket. Dominic Fletcher was the first to break the paralysis, his face contorted from shock into a deep, desperate rage. The thought of a local independent mechanic overriding his corporate authority in front of a billionaire executive like Vivian Sterling was completely unacceptable. He stepped forward, his leather loafers splashing into a deep puddle, and lunged toward the radio console. Captain Reyes, disregard this man immediately. Dominic screamed into the open air, trying to pull the microphone out of Garrett's hand. This is an unauthorized breach of an emergency frequency. You will follow standard regional airline protocol. Oakhaven Tower, cut this transceiver now. Garrett didn't flinch. He didn't even look at Dominic. As the operations director reached for the cord, Garrett simply shifted his weight. His broad shoulder caught Dominic square in the chest with the unyielding force of a steel beam. The impact sent Dominic stumbling backward across the slick asphalt, his arms flailing before he landed hard on his hands and knees in the cold mud beside the runway markers. His expensive navy blazer was instantly ruined, soaked in filthy rainwater. His corporate dignity shattered in front of dozens of his own employees. Winston, get security. Dominic roared from the ground, his voice cracking with humiliation as he scrambled to his feet, shivering and wiping muck from his palms. He's hijacking the frequency! This is a federal offense! Vivian Sterling stepped directly into Dominic's path. Her coat was drenched, her dark hair plastered to her face, but her emerald eyes possessed a lethal brightness that instantly froze the director in his tracks. If you take one more step toward that radio, Dominic, I will personally call your chief executive officer, Vivian said, her voice dropping into a razor-sharp whisper that carried perfectly over the wind. I hold 30% of your airline's primary landing bonds. By tomorrow morning, your position will be entirely dissolved, and you will be blacklisted from every commercial airfield on the Atlantic coast. Sit down, shut up, and let him save your passengers. Dominic's jaw trembled. He looked at Vivian's icy expression, then down at his mud-soaked clothes, and slowly stepped back into the shadows of the support vehicles, completely silenced. Vivian turned her eyes back to Garrett. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a violent, chaotic sensation she hadn't felt in a decade. In the boardroom, she was an absolute dictator, capable of manipulating markets with a single signature. But looking up at the gray sky, listening to the distant, dying whine of a failing aircraft engine, she felt completely, terrifyingly helpless. Money couldn't fix a ruptured hydraulic line. Power couldn't stop a plane from exploding on impact. She felt a deep, unfamiliar vulnerability opening up inside her chest. Then she looked at Chloe. The 7-year-old girl was standing perfectly steady beside her father, her small hands holding the diagnostic pad up so Garrett could see the telemetry data. There was no fear in the child's eyes. None at all. Chloe looked up at Garrett with the absolute, unquestioning certainty that as long as her dad was standing there, the sky would obey him. Vivian realized that all her billions had never bought her a single second of the profound peace this little girl possessed in the middle of a disaster. Garrett pressed the talk button, his voice completely level, completely grounding the panic in the sky. Lawrence, listen to my voice. You don't have the altitude for another loop. The storm is pushing a crosswind from the east at 30 knots. If you try to land straight, the stuck right gear will catch the pooling water and tear the wing completely off the fuselage. We're entering the cloud break now, Spectre 1, Captain Reyes' voice crackled back, trembling but focused. The cabin pressure is stable, but the manual override latch is completely frozen. I can't get the green light on the right main gear. What's the play? You're going to side-slip the aircraft? Garrett commanded, his gray eyes scanning the horizon as a dark shape finally punctured the low, heavy ceiling of the storm. Bring her down on the left gear first. Keep the right wing lifted into the wind. At the exact moment of touchdown, you're going to violently cut your left engine thrust and kick the rudder hard right. The sudden lateral force will use the wind's own resistance to snap that stubborn mechanical latch into place. It's going to feel like a crash, Lawrence. But the steel will hold. Understood, Spectre 1. Executing now. God bless you, sir. Suddenly, the twin-engine regional transport roared out of the gray mist, angling sharply toward the primary runway. It was terrifyingly unstable, buffeted by the heavy wind, tilting dangerously to one side. The onlookers on the tarmac gasped, several mechanics covering their eyes as the massive aircraft hurtled toward the slick, reflective asphalt. The left tire slammed into the runway with a deafening screech of burning rubber, sending a massive plume of white water 50 feet into the air. The plane skidded violently, its right wing tipping dangerously low toward the ground, threatening to ignite the fuel tanks against the concrete. Vivian instinctively gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her knees buckling slightly from the sheer terror of the visual. Without thinking, her trembling hand reached down and gripped Garrett's arm. His forearm felt like solid iron beneath his wet sleeve, entirely unmoving, completely steady. From the runway, a horrific, screeching sound of tearing metal echoed across the airfield. The screeching sound of tearing metal tore through the roaring wind, a violent, agonizing screech that caused every ground technician on the tarmac to hold their breath. The regional transport jet slid down the center line of runway 3, its right wing dipping dangerously close to the flooded concrete as the aircraft threatened to spin out of control. Then, exactly as Garrett had commanded, the left engine went completely dark. The sudden, brutal loss of asymmetrical thrust combined with a hard right rudder kicked the tail of the plane sideways. The crosswind caught the lifted right wing with tremendous force, creating a massive pocket of aerodynamic resistance. A loud, resonant thud echoed across the open field, a deep, mechanical snap that vibrated through the asphalt under Vivian's feet. The stubborn right landing gear had locked into place. The tire slammed down onto the runway, stabilizes the aircraft just as it skidded into the secondary overrun zone, throwing up a colossal wall of spray before finally slowing to a grinding halt. For 3 seconds, the airfield was dead silent. The only sound was the steady hiss of rain hitting the hot brakes of the emergency trucks. Then, the radio console erupted. "Oak Haven ground, we are down. We are down and locked." Captain Reyes' voice broke through the static, sounding breathless, laughing with a mixture of raw adrenaline and overwhelming relief. The latch snapped. No fire. No casualties. The cabin is secure. Spectre 1, sir, you just saved 42 lives. Thank you. The tarmac erupted into an absolute frenzy of cheers. Support mechanics threw their caps into the air, and Winston Briggs collapsed against the side of the fire engine, wiping a mixture of sweat and rain from his face as he let out a jagged sob of relief. Dominic Fletcher, still shivering and covered in dark mud, slowly got up from his knees. He looked toward the safe aircraft, then at the cheering crowd, and finally at Garrett Vance. He realized with absolute, crushing clarity that his corporate authority had been completely dismantled, not by a failure, but by a miracle he had tried to prevent. No one was looking at him. His employees were moving past him as if he were invisible, rushing to assist the disembarking passengers. Garrett smoothly unclipped the tactical headset and handed it back to Chloe. His expression hadn't changed. His jaw remained steady, his eyes calm, his posture completely unburdened by the miraculous feat he had just engineered. He reached down and gently took the digital diagnostic pad from his daughter's hands. "Good job holding the telemetry, Bug," Garrett murmured, his voice warm and private amidst the chaotic celebration surrounding them. "You didn't miss a single data point." Chloe beamed, her gray eyes shining with pride as she hooked her fingers into the loops of his oversized flight jacket. "I knew the wing wouldn't tip, Dad. Your math is always right." Vivian stood frozen, her hands slowly dropping from Garrett's iron forearm. Her fingers were still trembling. The cold rain was dripping from the edge of her tailored coat, but she didn't feel the chill anymore. Her mind was a chaotic vortex of confusion, awe, and an intense, overwhelming curiosity. She looked at Garrett, this quiet, humble, single father who worked out of a drafty hangar, who wore faded shirts and had grease permanently etched into his skin, and realized she was looking at a ghost. "Spectre 1, Vivian said, her voice barely louder than a whisper, yet carrying a profound weight. She stepped closer to him, ignoring the mud splashing against her expensive leather boots. "That's a classified United States Air Force call sign from the Elite Special Operations Tactical Evaluations Wing. That division was officially decommissioned 7 years ago after the Black Ops crisis in the Balkans. The lead commander was scrubbed from every public register." Garrett turned his head, his calm gray eyes meeting her piercing emerald gaze. The storm seemed to pale in comparison to the unyielding stillness in his face. "I'm just a mechanic, Vivian. I keep things flying." "A mechanic doesn't command a commercial airline pilot by his first name," she countered, her voice shaking slightly as she tried to regain her usual corporate control. "A mechanic doesn't cause a 3-star general to retreat in fear across a luxury restaurant." "Who are you, Garrett?" Before Garrett could reply, a sleek black government-issued SUV blew past the airfield security gate, its tires screaming against the wet asphalt as it accelerated directly toward Hangar 4. The vehicle fishtailed slightly before braking hard right in front of them, its dark-tinted windows reflecting the crimson emergency strobes. The heavy door flung open, and General Arthur Pendleton stepped out into the pouring rain. He didn't care about his decorated uniform getting soaked. His face was pale, his eyes wide with an urgent, desperate intensity as he ignored the surrounding crowd and marched straight toward Garrett. "Sir," General Pendleton barked, stopping exactly 3 paces away. To the absolute horror and speechlessness of Dominic Fletcher and the remaining airfield staff, the 3-star general snapped his hand up into a rigid, flawless military salute. "We have a critical national security situation at the Regional Defense Compound. The automated drone guidance array has suffered an internal systemic compromise. You are the only person alive who knows the source code. I need you to come with me immediately." The sight of a 3-star general standing at rigid attention, saluting a man covered in grease and rainwater, struck the remaining crowd like a physical blow. The cheers of the mechanics died instantly. Winston Briggs froze mid-stride, his jaw dropping so low it looked unhinged. Dominic Fletcher, still clutching his ruined, mud-caked blazer, looked as though he had been struck by lightning. His eyes darted from the general's uniform to Garrett's weathered face, his mind violently rewiring itself as the realization of his catastrophic error settled heavily into his gut. Vivian Sterling felt the breath leave her lungs entirely. She had dealt with senators, governors, and international defense ministers, but she had never seen General Pendleton, a man notorious for his cold, unyielding arrogance in defense briefings, look at anyone with the level of absolute, submissive reverence he was currently showing Garrett Vance. Garrett did not return the salute. He kept his hands dropped casually at his sides, his eyes narrowing slightly into an expression of quiet disapproval. The rain continued to pelt his face, dripping off his chin, but his stance remained as unmovable as a mountain. "I'm retired, Arthur," Garrett said, his voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly calm register that immediately suppressed the sound of the wind. "I signed the papers 7 years ago. My code is archived. Find someone at the Pentagon." "The Pentagon engineers have already bricked 2 primary mainframes trying to force a bypass, sir," General Pendleton replied, his voice tight with raw desperation. He didn't lower his hand until Garrett gave him a microscopic nod. The compromised drone array controls the entire eastern seaboard's automated border patrol grid. Right now, 12 high-altitude tactical platforms are drifting off course over the Atlantic, completely unresponsive to satellite commands. In 40 minutes, they will exceed their fuel threshold and drop into commercial shipping lanes. Millions of lives are at risk. The entire infrastructure is built on your core logic. If you don't override the system, we have to shoot them down, and the fallout will be catastrophic. The silence that followed was suffocating. The massive airfield felt small, compressed under the weight of a crisis that money, corporate influence, and political status could do absolutely nothing to solve. Vivian watched Garrett's profile. She saw the subtle tightening of the muscle in his jaw, the way his gray eyes scanned the digital diagnostic pads still held in his hand, processing a million calculations in a fraction of a second. He was no longer just the humble father who fixed brakes or comforted his crying daughter. He was the hidden architect of the very sky they stood under. Dominic Fletcher took a trembling step forward, his voice cracking as he tried to inject himself back into reality. General Pendleton. There must be a mistake. This man runs a bankrupt garage in Hangar 4. He just assaulted me on a live tarmac. He's a civilian. General Pendleton spun around, his green eyes flashing with a predatory, lethal anger that instantly choked the words out of Dominic's throat. "If you open your mouth again in the presence of this man, Director Fletcher, I will have the military police detail lock you in a federal holding cell under the Patriot Act before your next breath." Garrett Vance designed the automated tactical architecture this country relies on. He has saved more lives than your entire corporate board will ever employ. "Get out of my sight." Dominic staggered back, his face completely drained of color, his knees shaking so violently he had to lean against the wet tire of a fire truck to keep from collapsing into the mud again. Garrett didn't look at Dominic. He looked down at Chloe. The 7-year-old girl was looking back up at him, her small fingers still hooked tightly into his flight jacket. She didn't look scared of the general, or the black SUVs, or the looming national emergency. She simply waited for her father's decision. "Dad," Chloe whispered, her clear gray eyes reflecting the crimson emergency lights. "The people on the ships below the drones. They don't have a hangar to hide in, do they?" Garrett's expression softened instantly. The fierce, rigid mask of a military legend dissolved into the warm, protective face of a father. He knelt down in front of her again, completely ignoring the general's frantic ticking clock. He smoothed a wet strand of hair from her forehead. "No, Bug, they don't," Garrett said softly. "Then you have to fix it." Chloe said, handing him a rugged, encrypted, military-grade flash drive she had pulled from the hidden inner lining of her small school backpack, a drive he had given her years ago for safekeeping. "I'll keep the bay doors open for you." Garrett took the drive, a small, proud smile touching his lips. He stood up, turning to face General Pendleton. The calm strength radiating from him seemed to steady the entire chaotic airfield. "I'm not leaving my daughter, Arthur," Garrett commanded, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "Bring the mobile terminal satellite uplink inside Hangar 4. We do it here, on my floor, under my terms." "Understood, sir," Pendleton barked, immediately spinning toward his aides. "Deploy the mobile server array to HEF 4. Move, move, move." As the military personnel scrambled into a frenzy of activity, hauling heavy, armored tech cases toward his workshop, Garrett turned his eyes to Vivienne. She was standing in the rain, looking at him with a profound, trembling vulnerability. The icy, controlled billionaire executive had completely vanished, replaced by a woman who realized she was standing in the presence of true, unbought safety. Garrett extended his hand toward her, his large calloused palm open. "It's drier inside, Vivienne. Come watch us work." The interior of Hangar 4 underwent a violent, seamless transformation. Within 4 minutes, military technicians clad in dark tactical gear had deployed 3 ruggedized armored server towers onto the stained concrete floor. The high-pitched, steady whine of portable satellite uplinks filled the air, cutting through the damp chill of the evening. Blue and white terminal screens illuminated the industrial space, casting sharp, flickering shadows against the aluminum walls and the broken carbon fiber model turbine sitting on the corner workbench. Winston Briggs stood just inside the threshold, his posture bent, holding a bundle of heavy-duty power cables with the eager compliance of a man trying to survive a tidal wave. He didn't dare speak. He simply watched the choreography of global defense infrastructure assembling itself inside his airfield's most modest leasehold. Vivienne sat on the edge of the old vinyl couch in the corner office, her soaked charcoal coat draped over the back of a metal chair. She was watching Garrett. Her fingers were laced tightly together in her lap, her knuckles pale. For the first time in her adult life, her mind wasn't occupied by quarterly margins, shareholder revolts, or the exhausting defensive calculations required to maintain her empire. She was entirely consumed by the quiet authority of the man standing at the center terminal. Garrett had plugged the encrypted drive Chloe gave him into the primary mainframe. He wasn't typing with frantic urgency. His movements were smooth, rhythmic, and incredibly sparse, his large hands moving across the mechanical keyboard with the effortless familiarity of a musician returning to a grand piano. "Arthur," Garrett said, his eyes never leaving the cascading lines of amber data shifting across his monitor. The Pentagon didn't brick the mainframes because of the firewall. They triggered the internal isolation protocol because they tried to command the array using an external server signature. The system thought it was under a foreign cyber assault. General Pendleton stood behind Garrett's right shoulder, his hat held tightly under his arm, sweat beads forming near his temples despite the cold draft entering through the open bay doors. "Can you force the bypass from here, sir?" "I don't need to force it," Garrett murmured, hitting a single definitive stroke on the enter key. "I just need to tell the system I'm home." On the primary display, a massive red terminal window instantly dissolved, replaced by a clean, deep blue interface. A series of 12 distinct digital geographic vectors appeared on the screen, each representing a high-altitude tactical platform drifting over the dark expanse of the Atlantic. Chloe stood on a small wooden crate right beside her father's elbow. She wasn't watching the military screens. She was watching her father's hands, her small fingers tracing the edge of his shop desk, as if memorizing the cadence of his logic. When a warning chime sounded from the console, indicating a sudden drop in a satellite signal, she didn't flinch. She simply tapped a green toggle on the lower diagnostic deck. "The backup transponder is clear now, Dad," Chloe whispered, her voice tiny but completely steady in the massive room. "Good eye, Bug," Garrett said softly, his jaw relaxing for a fraction of a second as he glanced down at her. Vivienne let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked from the child to the father, the profound contrast between their domestic warmth and the terrifying scale of the crisis striking her with immense force. True power, she realized, wasn't about the size of a corporate building or the number of people you could intimidate into silence. True power was the ability to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders while ensuring your child felt absolutely nothing but safety. Suddenly, a loud commotion broke out near the hangar doors. Dominic Fletcher was arguing frantically with two armed military guards who had blocked his entry. His hair was plastered to his forehead, his face flushed a deep, humiliated crimson as he pointed a shaking finger inside. "I am the Regional Operations Director for this entire aviation sector," Dominic hissed, his voice echoing off the corrugated iron roof. "My executive board members are currently in the emergency hangar next door, and they are demanding an immediate briefing on the status of the regional flight tracking systems. I have every right to see what is happening to our local navigation grid." General Pendleton didn't even turn his head. He simply looked at the security lieutenant standing near the server towers. "Remove him from the property. Revoke his security credentials for every military and commercial facility under our jurisdiction. Now." The guards didn't hesitate. They gripped Dominic's arms, lifting him slightly off his feet as they dragged him backward into the dark, pouring rain. His boots scraped uselessly against the concrete, his desperate, muffled protests fading into the rumble of the thunder outside. Garrett ignored the distraction entirely. He entered a final sequence of command parameters into the terminal. On the tracking screen, the 12 red vectors slowly shifted color, turning a bright, stable green as they uniformly altered their headings, steering clean away from the commercial shipping lanes and returning to their designated patrol orbits. The main terminal emitted a long, low confirmation tone. The military technicians in the hangar collectively exhaled, several of them slumping back against their equipment crates in sheer relief. General Pendleton closed his eyes for a 3-second pause, his chest rising and falling before he snapped his eyes back to Garrett, his expression filled with a profound, almost religious reverence. "The grid is fully restored, sir," Pendleton said, his voice thick with emotion. "The platforms are back online. You've just averted a national catastrophe." Garrett reached down, pulled the flash drive from the terminal slot, and slipped it back into his pocket. He looked at the general with a flat, uncompromising gaze. "Pack up your gear, Arthur. The rain is letting up, and my daughter needs to finish her project before morning." "Understood, Commander," Pendleton said, stepping back and delivering a final, deeply respectful bow of his head. "We're moving out." As the technicians began dismantling the temporary server array with quiet efficiency, the heavy, chaotic energy of the government intervention began to drain out of Hangar 4, leaving behind the familiar, grounding sense of oil, cold metal, and rain. Vivian slowly stood up from the vinyl couch. She walked toward Garrett, her boots silent against the concrete floor. She stopped a few feet away, her emerald eyes searching his face, her usual defensive posture completely gone. Her hands were still slightly cold, but as she looked at him, the trembling finally stopped. "I spent the last 10 years believing that everyone wanted something from me, Garrett," Vivienne said, her voice dropping into a soft, genuine register that was entirely devoid of corporate calculation. "My position, my influence, my family's money. But you didn't even know who I was when you lay down under my car in the mud." Garrett looked at her, his expression warm, his steady gray eyes holding her gaze with an unyielding security. "The machine was broken, Vivienne. It didn't matter whose name was on the registration." The military vehicles departed as swiftly as they had arrived, their dark shapes disappearing into the midnight mist of the Oak Haven airfield. The sudden absence of the roaring server fans left Hangar 4 profoundly quiet. The only remaining sound was the gentle, rhythmic patter of the dying storm against the metal roof, a peaceful, cleansing sound that seemed to wash away the remnants of a nearly catastrophic night. Winston Briggs stepped into the center of the bay, his posture humble and filled with immense gratitude. He looked at Garrett with a soft, deeply respectful smile. "The lease on Hangar 4 is locked in for the next 20 years, Garrett. I just personally authorized the corporate waiver. You won't see a single rent increase as long as I'm running this airfield. And if you ever need additional space, Hangar 5 is yours, free of charge." Garrett nodded once, a brief, genuine gesture of appreciation. "Thanks, Winston. Just keep the runway clear for the morning deliveries." Winston tipped his hat and walked out into the night, closing the heavy bay doors halfway to block out the cool midnight air. Garrett turned back toward the workbench, where the shattered carbon fiber model turbine lay in pieces. He didn't look tired. His presence remained entirely grounded, steady, and focused. He knelt down in front of the workbench, looking at his daughter. "All right, Bug," Garrett said, his voice a warm, comforting anchor in the vast room. "We have exactly 5 hours before the Advanced Science Academy evaluation begins. Let's look at this staging module again." Chloe smiled. her gray eyes completely bright, her earlier exhaustion entirely forgotten. She climbed onto her wooden crate, picking up a tiny calibration tool. "We need to adjust the compression ratio on the secondary blade assembly, Dad." The old balance was off by 2 millimeters. "Then we'll make it perfect," Garrett murmured, his large calloused fingers gently guiding her smaller hands as they began the intricate process of reconstruction. Vivian walked over from the corner office, her dark hair falling loosely around her shoulders, her movements completely devoid of the rigid corporate guard she usually maintained. She didn't stay back in the shadows this time. She stepped right up to the workbench, pulling up a worn wooden stool and sitting across from them. She looked at the scattered pieces of the model, then at Garrett. "Show me what to hold," Vivian said softly. Garrett looked up, a faint, surprised glint of humor touching his gray eyes. "This is aerospace engineering, Vivian. It gets messy." "I own a defense logistics corporation, Commander," she replied, a genuine, beautiful smile breaking across her face, a smile that held no calculation, no power play, just pure warmth. "I think I can manage a 2 millimeter blade adjustment." For the next 4 hours, the billionaire CEO, the elite military legend, and the 7-year-old girl worked together under the warm, steady amber glow of the hangar lights. Vivian held the delicate carbon fiber housings in place with steady hands, her fingers occasionally brushing against Garrett's calloused palms. Each time their eyes met, a silent, profound understanding passed between them, an unspoken recognition that the vast distance between their worlds had completely dissolved in the quiet sanctuary of the workshop. By 4 in the morning, the model turbine was fully rebuilt. It was spectacular, its dual compressor staging perfectly balanced, its sleek housing reflecting the industrial lights with flawless precision. Chloe leaned her head against Garrett's arm, her eyelids heavy, her breathing deep, and even as she finally succumbed to sleep, her small fingers still clutching a micro-wrench. Garrett gently lifted his daughter into his arms, wrapping her securely in his oversized flight jacket. He carried her to the passenger seat of his pickup truck, laying her down carefully before walking back into the quiet hangar. Vivian was standing by the open bay doors, looking out at the horizon, where the first faint streaks of a pale blue dawn were beginning to break through the clouds. The storm had completely passed. The airfield was perfectly still, the wet runways glistening like glass under the morning light. She turned as Garrett approached, her green eyes clear and filled with an emotion she no longer felt the need to hide. "I spoke to my mother while you were transferring the terminal data, Garrett." Garrett stood beside her, his shoulders squared against the morning chill. "How did that go?" "I told her that the math she used to measure my life was entirely wrong," Vivian said, her voice dropping into a soft, steady whisper that carried perfectly in the quiet air. "I told her that I've spent my entire career surrounded by billionaires, executives, and powerful suitors who wanted to buy a piece of my world. But I've never met a single one who could offer me peace. I told her I found a man who gives safety without even trying." Garrett looked down at her, his expression filled with a deep, unyielding warmth. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently cupping her cheek, his thumb smoothing over her jawline. "The life I have isn't clean, Vivian." It's early mornings, grease-stained shirts, and an 8-year-old who thinks she can out-engineer the Pentagon. Vivian leaned into the touch of his hand, her trembling completely gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of wholeness. "It sounds like the only life worth building, Garrett." He smiled, a full, genuine look that reached his eyes. "Then let's go get her to that evaluation." They walked out of Hangar 4 together, their silhouettes framed by the rising American sun as it flooded the airfield with bright golden light. Behind them, the sign of Vance Aero stood clean and proud against the sky. Ahead of them, the future was wide open, vast, and entirely secure.